That morning unfolded with the kind of quiet normalcy that makes a person lower their guard without realizing it, blending into a routine that felt stable and predictable, which is why Evelyn Harris did not recognize that anything had already begun shifting beneath the surface of her life in a way that would soon make everything she believed feel incomplete and dangerously outdated. She moved through her routine with steady focus, reviewing notes for an online meeting, while her laptop struggled again, freezing between commands in a way that had become increasingly common over the past several days, which she had dismissed as nothing more than a minor technical inconvenience, rather than something that would force her into a situation she was not prepared for. And when the screen locked completely, interrupting her work at the worst possible moment, she exhaled slowly and adjusted her plan without hesitation. Jonathan Johnson sat in the living room, relaxed and absorbed in his phone with a kind of detached calm that suggested nothing in his world required urgency. And when she asked if she could borrow his laptop for a short time, his reaction came just slightly delayed, subtle enough to be ignored in the moment, yet precise enough to later stand out in memory with unsettling clarity. He pointed toward the dining table without meeting her eyes, offering a simple answer that blended seamlessly into the rhythm of their everyday interactions, and she accepted it without a second thought, because there had never been a reason not to. She carried the laptop back with her, opened it, and typed in the password she already knew, a familiar sequence tied to her own birthday that triggered a quiet, almost reflexive sense of comfort, because it reminded her of a time when small gestures still carried meaning instead of existing as habits left behind by something that had slowly faded. The meeting connected, her camera remained off, and she lowered the volume slightly while opening a document to take notes, settling into the steady rhythm of listening and typing, her attention divided but controlled, until a soft notification sound interrupted that flow in a way that felt insignificant, yet strangely persistent. At first glance, it looked like any routine message, something automated or work-related, but the subject line held her attention longer than it should have, carrying a sense of familiarity she could not immediately explain. And the words "Rosewood Suite confirmed" created a pause that did not belong in an otherwise ordinary morning. For a brief moment, she considered ignoring it, letting it disappear along with everything else that demanded her attention. Yet something instinctive pushed her to open it, and when the message expanded across the screen, the clarity of its contents left no space for misinterpretation. The reservation was for a luxury hotel located not far from their home, a place she recognized vaguely but had never entered. And the details were precise, deliberate, and carefully structured in a way that made them impossible to dismiss, because 2 nights had been booked, a private suite had been selected, and additional services had been included in a way that transformed the stay into something intentionally intimate rather than practical. As she continued reading, the dates aligned exactly with the previous weekend, the same time Jonathan had explained his absence as an overnight work commitment, delivered calmly and without hesitation. And a quiet tension began to form in her chest as the information started organizing itself into something she was not yet ready to fully acknowledge. When she noticed the attached images, her movement slowed almost involuntarily, and the first image revealed the suite itself, arranged with deliberate elegance, warm lighting, soft gold accents, and a single red rose placed at the center of the bed, a detail that shifted the entire context of the room into something personal and unmistakable. The second image removed any remaining distance, because Jonathan appeared in it, leaning back against white pillows with a relaxed and unguarded expression, as if the moment required no explanation. And the necklace around his neck caught the light in a way she recognized instantly, a piece she had given him long ago, now disconnected from everything it once symbolized. Her fingers moved more slowly as she opened the final image, a quiet awareness settling in before she could define it. And when the photo appeared, recognition arrived immediately and completely. A woman lay beside him, her posture natural, her attention turned slightly away from the camera as she held a glass of wine with effortless familiarity. And although only part of her face was visible, it was more than enough for Evelyn to understand exactly what she was looking at. The angle of her profile, the way her hair fell across her shoulder, the thin silver anklet resting against her skin, and the small mark near her shoulder all aligned into a truth that erased every possible alternative. Clara Bennett was in that bed. Her sister was in that bed with her husband. The realization did not unfold gradually or leave room for doubt, and while nothing in the room around her changed, something within her shifted completely because the faint voices from the meeting continued in the background, while her breathing slowed in a controlled and almost unnatural way that signaled something deeper than shock. She stared at the screen until it dimmed, the images fading as if the moment itself refused to remain visible any longer. And when her thoughts attempted to reshape what she had seen into something less absolute, every possibility collapsed before it could fully form. There had been no mistake and no coincidence, only a clarity that refused to soften. She disconnected from the meeting without remembering what she said, her actions controlled and deliberate, and when she stood, her movements remained steady while Jonathan continued sitting in the living room, unaware, unchanged, and completely disconnected from the reality she had just uncovered. When he looked up and asked if everything was all right, his tone carried the same casual ease, and she responded in the same controlled manner, offering nothing that would disturb that illusion before walking past him and closing herself inside the bedroom. She locked the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and fixed her gaze on the floor, holding herself in place while everything inside her shifted, broke, and reassembled into something new. Because what settled within her was not panic, and not even heartbreak in the way she had once understood it, but a quiet and controlled clarity that moved through her thoughts with deliberate precision, assembling the truth piece by piece until nothing uncertain remained. And that clarity did not weaken her, it steadied her, for what would come next. The silence that followed did not offer comfort, and it did not soften what she had seen, because instead of fading, every detail became sharper, forcing her mind to move backward through recent days and weeks with a level of attention she had never applied before, as if something within her had shifted from trust into analysis without giving her time to resist. Memories began to reorganize themselves, not as a single sequence, but as fragments that slowly connected into something structured and undeniable. And Evelyn found herself revisiting conversations she had once dismissed, hearing them again with a clarity that made them impossible to ignore. She remembered the evening she had suggested that Clara come stay with them for a few days, an offer made naturally and without hesitation, driven by concern and a sense of responsibility that had always defined their relationship. And she now recalled the brief pause that followed on the other end of the call, a hesitation so small it had seemed irrelevant at the time. Clara had asked whether Jonathan would be comfortable with that, her tone light and casual on the surface, yet carrying something underneath that Evelyn had not questioned, because questioning her sister had never been part of how their relationship worked, and Evelyn had reassured her easily, explaining that there was no reason for concern and that everything would be fine. Later that evening, while they stood side by side in front of the bathroom mirror, moving through the familiar routine of brushing their teeth, she mentioned it again, expecting nothing more than a simple agreement. Yet Jonathan responded differently than she expected, suggesting that the timing might not be ideal because work was overwhelming and he would barely be home, adding that it might feel uncomfortable for Clara under those circumstances. At the time, it had sounded reasonable and practical, but now it felt calculated, not as hesitation, but as a quiet adjustment of timing that allowed something else to unfold without interruption. And Evelyn realized she had accepted that explanation without resistance, simply moving the plan forward without examining it further. In the days that followed, small changes that had once blended into the background began to stand out with increasing clarity, and one of the first was the shift in his cologne, a stronger and heavier scent that lingered longer than anything he had worn before, which she had jokingly questioned at the time, only to receive a casual explanation about testing a sample from work. She had believed him without hesitation, not because the explanation was particularly convincing, but because it aligned with the version of him she trusted, and that trust had removed the need to look deeper. Around the same time, Clara had mentioned that she would not be reachable over the weekend, explaining that she needed to disconnect and clear her mind, something Evelyn had interpreted as healthy and necessary, because it fit perfectly into the narrative of someone trying to recover from emotional damage. Now, those timelines aligned differently, not as coincidence but as coordination, and the realization settled slowly, connecting Clara's absence with Jonathan's in a way that made the pattern impossible to ignore. Other details surfaced alongside it, including a receipt Evelyn had once found in Jonathan's jeans while doing laundry, something she had dismissed without thought because it lacked context, yet now returned as a meaningful piece of something larger she had overlooked. His behavior with his phone had shifted as well, not dramatically but consistently, because where he had once left it unattended, he now kept it close, carrying it with him even in moments that had never required privacy. And although she had noticed, she had chosen not to question it, because questioning would have meant acknowledging doubt. Late at night, he had begun texting more frequently, his screen angled away from her, and when she asked who it was, he offered simple explanations about work or colleagues that sounded ordinary enough to accept, and she allowed those answers to stand without pushing further, eventually turning away and letting sleep replace the quiet instinct that suggested something had changed. There had also been a message from Clara that now returned with unsettling weight, a question that had once seemed abstract, asking whether she had ever wondered if she truly knew the people around her. And at the time, Evelyn had responded lightly, dismissing its depth, interpreting it as one of many reflective moods her sister passed through. Now, it no longer felt abstract. It felt intentional. Each of these moments, insignificant on their own, formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. And what unsettled Evelyn the most was not the existence of that pattern, but the realization that it had always been there, visible and accessible, yet completely unrecognized. She had not been blind. She had been trusting. And that distinction now carried consequences she could no longer avoid. Clara had always been more than just a sister, because their relationship had been built over years of shared experiences, trust, and loyalty that felt unbreakable. And even when their lives moved in different directions, that connection had remained constant. When Clara's marriage collapsed, Evelyn had been the first person she turned to, the one who listened, who supported, and who stayed, believing she was helping someone rebuild after being broken by betrayal. And those moments had felt genuine, real, and deeply meaningful. Clara had cried. Clara had trusted her. Clara had spoken about envy, about wishing she had what Evelyn had built. At the time, those words had felt like admiration, but now they carried a completely different meaning, one that reframed everything Evelyn thought she understood. Jonathan had always treated Clara with kindness and attentiveness, especially during the time when she was vulnerable, and Evelyn had seen that as confirmation of his character, rather than something that required scrutiny, because he listened, he supported, and he created comfort in a way that felt appropriate. Now, with everything laid out in front of her, Evelyn understood that what she had interpreted as kindness might have been something far more deliberate, something that had developed quietly beneath the surface of trust she had never questioned. And the most unsettling realization was not simply that it had happened. It was that it had happened so close to her, within her life, without resistance, and without her ever seeing it for what it truly was. At the time, everything about the way Jonathan treated Clara had seemed completely natural, even reassuring, because he had always shown a quiet willingness to help that made his actions appear appropriate rather than questionable. And Evelyn had interpreted every one of those moments as confirmation of his character, instead of something that required deeper attention. He helped Clara carry groceries whenever she visited, taking the heavier bags without hesitation, and moving through the apartment with a familiarity that felt comfortable rather than intrusive. And there had been an evening when he drove across the city just to help her deal with a dead car battery, returning hours later with a simple explanation that he had done what anyone would have done in that situation. There had also been a birthday when he arranged for flowers to be delivered to her, signing the gesture in a way that included Evelyn, presenting it as something shared and thoughtful, and Evelyn had smiled when she saw it, believing it reflected a kind of closeness that strengthened their family rather than complicating it. She had even spoken about it openly, sometimes with a quiet sense of pride, explaining to others how much she appreciated the way her husband and her sister got along, describing their connection as something almost sibling-like, something rare and reassuring. And at the time, those words had felt entirely true. Now, those same memories carried a different meaning, not because the events themselves had changed, but because the context surrounding them had shifted in a way that made everything feel misinterpreted. There had been a Sunday not long before everything began to unravel, when Clara came to spend the afternoon with them, bringing food she knew Jonathan liked, and moving through the apartment with an ease that felt completely natural. And the three of them had spent hours on the balcony, talking and laughing about childhood memories in a way that seemed effortless. Clara had appeared more relaxed that day than she had in weeks, lighter, almost restored, and Evelyn remembered feeling relieved to see that change, believing it meant her sister was finally beginning to heal from everything she had been through. At one point, Clara stood up and brushed something off Jonathan's shoulder, a small and seemingly insignificant gesture that lasted only a moment, and he reacted with a slight flinch before smiling, an expression that at the time appeared casual but now felt controlled when replayed in memory. Evelyn had not questioned it then, because there had been no reason to, yet now that moment returned repeatedly in her mind, forcing her to examine it from every angle because she could no longer tell whether it had marked the beginning of something or whether it had simply been the first moment she could have noticed if she had been looking differently. Later that evening, after Clara had left, Jonathan made a comment that had once felt unimportant, but now stood out with unsettling clarity, because he mentioned that Clara seemed different, softer, changed in a way he could not fully explain. And when Evelyn asked what he meant, he dismissed it with a vague explanation that she had grown. At the time, that had been enough, but now it felt like the first moment his perception of Clara had shifted into something more personal. Other details followed when Evelyn allowed herself to look back without filtering what she saw. Because there had been subtle changes in the way Clara looked at him. Moments where her gaze lingered just slightly longer than it should have, and times when Jonathan responded to her with a level of attention that felt different from how he interacted with anyone else. Evelyn had noticed those things in passing, but she had never allowed them to become suspicion, because suspicion required doubt, and doubt required a willingness to question people she trusted completely. She had chosen not to question, because trust had always felt stronger than doubt. There had been an evening when Evelyn was sick, exhausted and feverish, barely able to move, while Jonathan was away for what he described as a work conference, and Clara had called, offering to come stay with her through the night, which Evelyn had accepted with quiet relief. Clara never arrived, later explaining that something unexpected had come up, and Evelyn had accepted that explanation without pressing further, managing through the night alone, telling herself it was not important. Now that memory carried a different weight, because the timing aligned too closely with everything else, forcing Evelyn to consider possibilities she had once dismissed entirely, and the thought that Clara might have been with Jonathan during that same time settled into her mind with a quiet but undeniable force. The realization did not come with immediate emotion, but it changed the way every memory felt, as if nothing could be trusted in the form it originally existed. She remembered a night just days earlier when Jonathan came home late, moving quietly through the apartment as if trying not to wake her, and when he leaned down to kiss her forehead, his voice carried the familiar explanation of a long day and exhaustion, which she had accepted without hesitation. When she turned toward him, intending to hold him briefly, she noticed a scent that did not belong to either of them. Something subtle but distinct, sweet and expensive, with a floral edge that lingered just long enough to register before fading. At the time, she had said nothing, but now she recognized it immediately because it was the same perfume Clara wore when she visited. Another memory surfaced alongside it, one that had once seemed insignificant, because Evelyn had been doing laundry as usual when she found a folded receipt in the pocket of Jonathan's jeans, something she had nearly thrown away before curiosity led her to glance at it. It listed room service, a suite level, and an amount large enough to stand out, yet it carried no name. And when she asked Jonathan about it, he responded casually, explaining that he had taken a client out and covered the cost. She had believed him without hesitation, because nothing in her experience with him suggested otherwise. Now that moment returned with clarity, no longer isolated but connected to everything else she had begun to see. Without fully deciding to, Evelyn logged into their shared bank account, her movements guided more by instinct than by intention. And as the page loaded, the delay stretched the moment in a way that made everything feel heavier. When the transactions appeared, the pattern was impossible to ignore, because large withdrawals had been made repeatedly over time, structured in a way that suggested planning rather than coincidence, appearing consistently at the same point each week. She remembered asking about those withdrawals before, receiving an explanation about investments and temporary expenses that would eventually return profit, and she had accepted that explanation just as easily as all the others. Now it felt like another piece of something she had never questioned. Even with everything aligning, one detail continued to press at the edge of her awareness, because the name Rosewood carried a familiarity that extended beyond the email she had seen. And after a moment, the memory surfaced clearly. Clara had celebrated an anniversary there years earlier, sharing photographs that captured every detail of the experience, and Evelyn had seen those images at the time without attaching significance to them. Now, that memory connected with everything else in a way that felt precise rather than accidental. The realization left her with no space for uncertainty, and without allowing herself too much time to think, she made a decision that felt completely outside her normal behavior, because she needed confirmation that went beyond suspicion. She went to the hotel herself, preparing carefully and controlling every detail of her appearance to ensure nothing about her presence would raise questions. And when she arrived, the atmosphere of the lobby carried a polished elegance that felt detached from everything she was experiencing internally. She approached the reception desk calmly, presenting herself as someone interested in booking a suite, maintaining a tone that matched the setting. And when she asked about availability, the receptionist responded with warmth and professionalism. During the conversation, a detail emerged that shifted everything from suspicion into certainty, because the receptionist mentioned a recent stay under a name Evelyn recognized instantly, a name tied directly to her family. Clara had used that name openly, without any attempt to conceal it, and Evelyn maintained her composure long enough to ask to see images of the suite, nodding as if evaluating options, before excusing herself with a simple explanation. Only after she stepped outside did the full weight of what she had confirmed begin to settle, because what had once existed as separate suspicions had now aligned into something undeniable. When she returned home, Jonathan was in the kitchen, moving through an ordinary moment that felt completely disconnected from everything she had just experienced. And when he spoke to her casually, she responded without engaging, passing by him as if nothing had changed. Later that night, while he was in the shower, something unusual happened. Because he left his phone on the bed, unlocked and visible, something he had not done in a long time, and the screen lit up with a message notification that carried just enough detail to draw her attention. She had never been the kind of person to look through someone else's phone, and she had never needed to. But in that moment, standing there with everything she already knew, choosing not to look no longer felt like trust, because it felt like refusing to see what was already in front of her. Her hesitation lasted only a moment because, even though she had never been the kind of person who searched through someone else's phone, the situation in front of her no longer belonged to the version of trust she had been holding onto. And before she could fully process the decision, her hands had already moved, unlocking the screen and opening the message that had just appeared. The words were simple, casual on the surface, yet loaded with meaning that became immediately clear the moment she read them, because the message spoke about missing him and counting down to the weekend, phrased in a way that carried familiarity and expectation. And although the contact name suggested something related to work, Evelyn understood instantly that there was nothing professional about what she was looking at. She opened the thread, and what unfolded in front of her did not feel like discovery in the usual sense, but rather confirmation of something that had already begun forming in her mind, because the conversation stretched back over weeks, filled with messages, voice notes, photographs, and plans that revealed a connection far deeper than anything she had allowed herself to consider. There was no ambiguity in what she saw, because the tone shifted between intimacy and playfulness in a way that left no space for misunderstanding. And although the name attached to the contact was not Clara's, the profile image removed any doubt, showing her clearly, smiling into a mirror with the same short haircut she had recently adopted. Evelyn sat down slowly, her body reacting before her thoughts could fully organize, as the weight of everything settled into something physical, something cold and steady, that replaced the uncertainty she had been holding on to. She continued reading, not because she wanted to, but because stopping felt impossible. And with each message, the reality became more defined, more structured, until the entire situation stood in front of her, with a clarity that could not be ignored. They had spoken about returning to the same places, about repeating experiences, about waking up together and extending moments that had already happened, and there were references to secrecy that confirmed exactly how carefully everything had been hidden, because Jonathan had reassured her that nothing had been noticed, that everything remained exactly as it appeared on the surface. There was even acknowledgement of guilt, expressed briefly and then dismissed, reframed into something softer, something easier to accept, as if redefining the situation would somehow make it less real, less damaging, less wrong. Evelyn understood then that what they had built was not impulsive or accidental, but deliberate and sustained, something that had been allowed to grow over time without interruption. Her response was immediate but controlled, because instead of reacting outwardly, she began capturing everything she saw, taking screenshots methodically and sending them to herself, creating a record that felt necessary even before she fully understood why. She was not ready to confront them, and she did not yet know what she would say when that moment came. But she knew she could not allow the truth to remain only in his possession. When she finished, she placed the phone back exactly where she had found it, careful to leave no indication that anything had been disturbed, and then she stepped out onto the balcony, needing space that felt separate from the room where everything had just changed. The air outside did not calm her, but it gave her enough distance to remain composed. and she stood there trying to slow the movement of her thoughts, which had begun racing through possibilities, consequences, and outcomes she was not yet ready to face. A few minutes later, Jonathan joined her, his presence as ordinary as everything else he had done that day, and when he asked if everything was all right, his voice carried no awareness of what had just unfolded, which made the moment feel almost surreal. She answered calmly, choosing her words with precision, and when he stepped closer and kissed her forehead, she allowed it without reacting, maintaining the same outward stability she had held since the moment she opened the email. What unsettled her most in that moment was not his behavior, but her own ability to mirror it, to remain composed, to respond naturally, to continue the performance as if nothing had changed. The next morning, she acted on an impulse that felt both controlled and necessary, because she needed to hear Clara's voice without the filter of recognition, and she called her from a different number, adjusting her tone to ensure it would not be immediately identified. Clara answered quickly, her voice soft and slightly distant, and for a brief moment, Evelyn simply listened, focusing on the familiarity of it. Before asking a simple question under the pretense of something unrelated, Clara responded cautiously, then ended the call just as quickly, leaving Evelyn with a sense that something had shifted even in that brief interaction, though it was impossible to determine whether it had been recognition or instinct. Later that day, Evelyn sent a message from her own number, something simple and neutral, asking if everything was all right, and when no response came, the silence felt more meaningful than any answer could have been. That evening, Jonathan returned home carrying food, presenting it as a surprise, suggesting they eat together on the balcony, and Evelyn accepted without resistance, matching his tone and behavior as if nothing had changed. They sat together, moving through the motions of a shared moment, talking about ordinary things, exchanging words that carried no weight, and as he raised his glass in a quiet gesture toward their life, she mirrored it without drinking, fully aware that what they were presenting to each other no longer existed in the form they were pretending it did. After several days of holding everything inside, the pressure became impossible to manage alone, and Evelyn realized that she needed someone who existed outside the situation, someone who could see clearly without being part of the deception. She went to her mother. She did not explain her decision to Jonathan, and she did not create a reason, because none of that mattered anymore. And early the next morning, she packed a small bag and left while he was still asleep, moving through the house quietly as if preserving the last moments of something that no longer had meaning. The drive felt longer than it should have, each moment stretching under the weight of everything she was carrying. And by the time she arrived, her composure had begun to fracture under the strain of holding everything in place. Her mother opened the door with warmth that disappeared the moment she saw Evelyn's face, because whatever she saw there required no explanation, and she pulled her inside immediately, asking what had happened with a directness that left no room for avoidance. Evelyn tried to speak, but the words did not come easily, because saying them out loud made them real in a way that thinking them never had, and instead she showed her everything, handing over her phone and allowing the evidence to speak in her place. Her mother read through the messages slowly, her expression tightening with each detail, and when she finally looked up, there was no uncertainty in her response, because she had already seen something that Evelyn had not. She explained that she had noticed Jonathan and Clara together weeks earlier, in a place where their presence together had not made sense. And although she had questioned it at the time, she had chosen not to act on it, hoping there was an explanation that would protect both of her daughters from unnecessary damage. Now, there was no explanation left to protect. The confirmation did not shock Evelyn as much as it deepened the reality she was already facing, because it removed any remaining doubt, leaving only the truth in its full form. They sat together for hours, talking through everything, allowing the weight of it to settle gradually, and her mother spoke with a kind of clarity that came from experience, acknowledging the complexity of what had happened without excusing any part of it. She spoke about Clara, about the ways in which pain and loneliness could distort judgment, about patterns that had existed long before this moment, and about the difference between understanding someone's actions and accepting them. She spoke about Jonathan with equal directness, removing any space for justification, and in doing so, she gave Evelyn something she had not yet been able to create on her own: perspective. Before Evelyn left, her mother held her face gently and reminded her that strength did not come from silence, and that pretending would not restore what had already been lost. And those words stayed with her as she drove back, replaying everything that had been said, allowing it to reshape the way she saw her own situation. By the time she reached the house, nothing about it had changed externally. Because the lights were on, the car was in the driveway, and everything appeared exactly as it had before. But for Evelyn, the difference was absolute. She was no longer trying to understand what had happened. She already knew. And for the first time since that morning, she was no longer uncertain about what needed to come next. The drive back from her mother's house unfolded in complete silence. Not because there was nothing left to think about, but because everything had already settled into place with a level of clarity that no longer required questions. And as the city moved around her in its usual rhythm, Evelyn Harris found herself no longer searching for explanations or alternative versions of what had happened, because the truth had already revealed itself in a way that could not be softened or reshaped. She thought about the precision of their lies, about the way Jonathan Johnson had moved through their shared life without disrupting its structure, maintaining routines, conversations, and small gestures that made everything appear intact. And she thought about how Clara Bennett had stood beside her, speaking about pain and betrayal, while at the same time becoming the source of it in someone else's life. And as these realizations settled deeper, something inside Evelyn shifted from reaction into decision. She no longer wanted to confront them in a way that would invite explanations, because explanations were built to blur reality and create space for forgiveness before the truth had fully landed, and she was no longer willing to allow that space to exist. Not after everything had been revealed with such deliberate carelessness. What she wanted was something they could not manipulate, something that would unfold in front of them without distortion, something that would force both of them to stand inside the truth they had created without the ability to step outside of it. By the time she reached the house, the structure of what she would do had already formed, not as an emotional reaction, but as a controlled and deliberate sequence of actions, built with the same attention to detail they had used to hide everything from her, only now redirected towards something they would not be able to escape. The following morning, she waited until Jonathan left, moving through the house with the same calm precision she had maintained since the moment everything began to change. And once she was alone, she used his card to book a suite at the same hotel that had become the center of everything, selecting the exact room she had seen in the photographs, ensuring that every detail would feel familiar to them in a way that would remove any possibility of denial. When Jonathan returned later that day, she told him she had planned a surprise weekend for them, presenting it in a way that felt natural and unforced, and his reaction revealed exactly what she expected, because he accepted without hesitation, trusting the version of her he believed still existed, unaware that the situation had already shifted into something he could not control. Later, she arranged the same for Clara, contacting her from a different number under the pretense of a hotel promotion, offering an experience that fit seamlessly into the life Clara had been living in secret. And Clara responded quickly, confirming without suspicion, because nothing in the message gave her a reason to question it. Evelyn coordinated the timing carefully, instructing Jonathan to arrive earlier and Clara slightly later, aligning their movements in a way that would bring them face to face inside the same space they had used to build their deception. And when everything was set, she packed her things, not for a weekend, but for a departure she already knew would be permanent. That afternoon, she arrived at the hotel ahead of both of them, moving through the lobby with a calm that did not draw attention. And once inside the suite, she prepared everything with quiet precision, ensuring that the space remained natural, untouched, and entirely believable, because authenticity would make what followed impossible to deny or reinterpret. She placed a small camera discreetly within the room, not out of a desire to expose them publicly, but because she understood that once confronted, both of them would attempt to reshape reality in a way that protected themselves, and she wanted a version of the truth that could not be altered. When Jonathan arrived, he stepped into the room with visible appreciation, commenting on the choice with a tone that suggested surprise rather than suspicion. And she responded calmly, allowing him to settle into the moment exactly as he expected, watching him move through the space with the same ease he had likely carried during the times he had been there before. A short time later, there was a knock at the door, and Jonathan's expression shifted slightly, uncertainty replacing comfort as the moment deviated from what he had expected. And when he asked whether someone else was arriving, Evelyn answered without tension and moved to open the door. Clara stood there. For a brief moment, everything remained suspended, because recognition moved through both of them at the same time, stripping away any illusion of control they believed they had. And as Clara's expression changed and Jonathan rose from his position, the truth that had been hidden for months became visible without a single word needing to be spoken. Evelyn stepped aside and allowed Clara to enter, not forcing the moment but allowing it to unfold naturally. And as the door closed behind them, the silence that filled the room carried more weight than any confrontation could have created. Jonathan attempted to speak, but whatever explanation he intended to offer failed before it could fully form, and Clara's voice followed the same path, breaking under the pressure of a situation that no longer allowed for controlled responses. Evelyn raised her hand slightly, not in anger, but as a clear boundary, and when she spoke, her voice remained calm, steady, and deliberate, because she was no longer reacting to what had happened, but presenting it exactly as it was. She described what she had seen, what she had confirmed, and what she understood now, removing every possible layer of ambiguity they might have attempted to use. And when Jonathan tried to redirect the conversation, suggesting they leave and discuss it elsewhere, she refused immediately because privacy had been the space where their deception had existed, and she was no longer willing to give it back to them. She handed him the evidence she had gathered, placing it in his hands in a form that forced him to confront it physically. And as he looked through it, the weight of everything became impossible to deny, not only because of what was there, but because of how clearly it had been documented. Clara remained silent for most of it, her posture collapsing inward as the reality settled over her. And when she finally tried to speak, her words carried hesitation rather than certainty, as if she was searching for something that could soften what had already been exposed. Evelyn did not allow that, because softening it would have meant rewriting it, and she was no longer willing to accept any version of the truth that differed from what she had seen. When she spoke to Clara directly, her voice did not carry anger, because anger would have given the moment emotional instability. And what she had instead was something far more final, because she acknowledged everything that had once existed between them, not to preserve it, but to make it clear that it no longer held any weight in the present. She made it clear that what had been broken was not only trust, but the foundation of every interaction they had shared over the past months, and that no explanation, no apology, and no attempt at justification could restore something that had been deliberately dismantled. When she finished, there was nothing left to say because everything that mattered had already been spoken, and she picked up her bag, turned toward the door, and left without looking back, because looking back would have suggested there was still something to hold on to. As she walked down the hallway, the weight she had been carrying shifted in a way that did not feel like relief, but like release, because she was no longer holding the truth inside herself. And for the first time since everything began, there was nothing left that required her to pretend. Later that evening, her phone began to ring, Jonathan's name appearing on the screen with the same familiarity it had always carried, followed by messages that attempted to explain, justify, and reshape what had happened into something less deliberate. But she did not answer, because answering would have meant stepping back into a version of reality she had already left behind. Clara's message followed, shorter, more careful, carrying the weight of everything that had once connected them. And for a moment, Evelyn looked at it, not with hesitation but with recognition of what it represented, before setting the phone aside without opening it. When she returned home, the house stood exactly as it had before, quiet and unchanged, yet completely different in meaning. And as she moved through it, taking only what belonged to her, she did so without urgency, without hesitation, and without the need to explain her actions to anyone. By the time she finished, there was nothing left that tied her to the version of her life that had existed before. And as she sat down, the silence around her no longer felt heavy, because it was no longer filled with things left unsaid. It was clean, it was final, and it was entirely hers. By the next morning, the calls had stopped, the messages had slowed, and whatever urgency had once existed on the other side had begun to fade. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because she had made it clear that she was no longer listening. And in that quiet space that followed, Evelyn understood something with a clarity that would remain long after everything else had settled, because what had changed was not only her relationship or her circumstances, but the way she saw truth itself. It was never the betrayal that held power over her. It was the illusion she had chosen to protect. And the moment she stopped protecting it was the moment she became free. If this story made you feel something, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling us what you would have done in the main character's place, and subscribe to Sinner Stories so you never miss a new video.